A huge day for President Trump's tariff policy. The Supreme Court is currently hearing arguments over the legality of the way the trade tariffs were imposed. And according to the president himself, the stakes could not be higher. Well, the case centres around whether he has the authority to impose sweeping tariffs on imports under a law designed for use during a national emergency. So let's get the thoughts of Justin Wolfers, Professor of Economics at the University of Michigan. And Justin, great to have you on the programme again. This is going to be a hugely significant decision, isn't it?
Okay, so a federal judge just dropped the hammer on the Trump administration. And I'm not talking about some minor legal slap on the wrist here. I'm talking about a series of explosive rulings that are absolutely devastating for Trump's team. Multiple judges across multiple jurisdictions have found unconstitutional abuses in policy and conduct across the entire executive branch. We're talking about findings of willful defiance of court orders, systematic abuse of power, intentional violations of constitutional rights. This is massive. And the consequences, they're just starting to unfold. Because these aren't just civil rulings that result in policy changes. We're talking about potential criminal contempt charges, potential criminal liability for top Trump administration officials, and maybe, just maybe, it consequences for Trump himself. This is the kind of legal reckoning that the administration has been able to avoid for years, but now the walls are closing in. And federal judges are sending a clear message. You don't get to ignore the law just because you're in the White House. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Of the impact that tariffs have had there in the US and elsewhere.
I think actually there's two sets of impacts. One is the direct one, which is tariffs raise costs. Those higher costs lead to lower profits for American businesses, or when they pass them on, higher prices for American consumers. That's the fairly direct thing. The second thing may be even larger, which is that America has shown itself to be a combative and often unwilling trading partner, an unreliable trading partner, and it's sort of tipped the bucket on the global trading system. And so you're seeing countries all around the world.
Let me give you the most damning example. On November 8th, 2025, a federal judge permanently blocked Trump from using the National Guard to crack down on immigration protests in Portland. But here's what makes this ruling so explosive. The judge didn't just say the administration's actions were improper. The judge lambasted the administration for violating a prior restraining order. That means Trump's team was already under a court order not to do something. And they did it anyway. They willfully defied the court. And the judge called them out on it. The ruling raised questions about whether this was willful defiance of the court, which is a fancy legal way of saying they knew what they were doing was illegal and they did it anyway. That's contempt of court territory. That's criminal liability territory. That's the kind of thing that can land people in jail. And we're not talking about low-level staffers here. We're talking about senior administration officials who authorized these actions. But wait, it gets worse. Judge McConnell in Rhode Island issued another devastating ruling. This one involved SNAP benefits. That's the federal food assistance program that feeds 42 million Americans. The judge found that the Trump administration withheld full SNAP benefits for political purposes. Not because of budget constraints, not because of legal requirements for political purposes. The judge accused officials of intentionally jeopardizing aid to 42 million Americans just to score political points and ordered immediate funding to be restored. Think about that for a second. A federal judge just found that Trump's team deliberately starved millions of Americans as a political tactic. That's not just bad policy, that's potentially criminal, that's using your government position to harm citizens for political gain. And the judge was so appalled by this conduct that the written opinion didn't mince words. It laid out exactly what the administration did and why it was wrong. And there's more. In Washington, another federal judge found Trump officials guilty of violating constitutional rights by targeting perceived political opponents and interfering with federal agencies. The court's written opinion denounced what it called systematic abuse of power, not isolated incidents, not mistakes. Systematic abuse, that means a pattern of behavior, a deliberate strategy to use the power of the federal government to go after people Trump doesn't like, And to interfere with agencies that are supposed to be independent, this is Nixon-level stuff. This is the kind of conduct that led to Watergate. And now we've got federal judges documenting it in official court rulings. Now, here's what makes all of this even more significant. The Trump administration is appealing these rulings, frantically appealing them. And that signals deep legal jeopardy for Trump's inner circle, because when you appeal, you're hoping a higher court will overturn the ruling. But in the meantime, the findings of fact from the lower court stand, the documentation of wrongdoing stands. And several district and appellate judges have already warned that future criminal contempt charges are possible if the administration keeps ignoring federal court orders. That's not speculation, that's judges saying on the record, if you defy us again, we will pursue criminal charges. And contempt of court isn't some minor offense. It can result in jail time, it can result in fines, it can end political careers. So the fact that judges are threatening this, the fact that they're putting it on the record, that tells you they're serious, they're done playing games with the Trump administration. So why does this matter? Why should you care about a bunch of court rulings that sound like they belong in law school textbooks? Because these sweeping judicial rebukes signal a broader legal reckoning for the Trump administration. They put senior officials, and Trump himself, at risk of further investigations, contempt charges, possible criminal liability. The rulings expose cracks in the White House's legal defenses, and they embolden congressional efforts to hold officials accountable. Remember all those calls for resignation and impeachment we've been talking about? Well, these court rulings give those efforts more ammunition, more legitimacy, more evidence that the Trump administration has been operating outside the law, and that makes it harder for Republicans to defend Trump, harder for them to argue that this is all just partisan attacks, because these aren't partisan politicians making accusations. These are federal judges, career professionals who are supposed to be above politics, documenting systematic abuses of power. That's a game changer. And we're going to break down exactly what these rulings say, what they mean for Trump's team, and what happens next. Because trust me, this is just the beginning of a legal avalanche that could bury the Trump administration. All right, let's dig into the specifics of these court rulings, because the details are what make this story so explosive. And when you really understand what the judges found, you start to see just how much trouble the Trump administration is in. So let's start with the Portland National Guard case. This ruling came down on November 8th from a federal judge in Oregon. Trump had ordered the National Guard to be deployed to Portland to crack down on immigration protests. Now, on its face, that might sound like a legitimate use of executive power. Presidents can deploy the National Guard during emergencies, but here's the problem. There was already a court order in place restricting how Trump could use the National Guard, a prior restraining order. And according to the judge's ruling, the Trump administration violated that order. They knew about it, they understood what it said, and they deployed the Guard anyway. That's willful defiance, that's contempt of court, contempt. And the judge was furious about it. According to reporting from OPB and Al Jazeera, the judge's ruling lambasted the administration for this violation. The opinion raised questions about willful defiance of the court. And here's what that means in practical terms. The judge is saying there's evidence that Trump officials knowingly violated a court order that opens the door to contempt proceedings, to sanctions, to potential criminal charges. Because when you willfully defy a court order, especially a federal court order, you're not just breaking a rule, you're attacking the judicial system itself. You're saying that court orders don't apply to you, that you're above the law, and federal judges don't take that lightly. So this Portland ruling isn't just about the National Guard deployment, it's about whether the Trump administration respects the authority of federal courts at all. And based on this ruling, the answer is no, they don't. Now let's talk about the SNAP benefits case. This one is particularly damning. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, provides food assistance to about 42 million Americans. It's a lifeline for low-income families, for seniors, for people who are struggling to put food on the table. And according to Judge McConnell's ruling in Rhode Island, the Trump administration deliberately withheld full SNAP benefits for political purposes, not because they had to, not because there was a legal requirement, for political purposes. The judge found that officials intentionally jeopardized aid to 42 million Americans. Let that sink in for a second. The administration, according to a federal judge, used hunger as a political weapon. They decided that withholding food assistance would give them leverage in some other political fight, and they did it, knowing full well that it would harm millions of vulnerable Americans. The judge ordered immediate funding to be restored, but the damage is done. Families went without food, people suffered, And it was all, according to the court, completely avoidable. It was a deliberate choice by the administration, and the judge's opinion made clear just how outrageous this conduct was. The written ruling accused officials of acting for political purposes. That's code for saying they abused their power. They put political calculations ahead of the welfare of the American people. And that's exactly the kind of abuse of power that can result in criminal charges, because if you're using your government position to harm citizens for political gain, that's corruption. That's potentially a federal crime, and this court ruling documents it all. And then there's the Washington case involving targeting of political opponents. This ruling found that Trump officials violated constitutional rights by going after people they viewed as enemies and by interfering with federal agencies that are supposed to be independent. The court's opinion talked about systematic abuse of power, not isolated incidents, not one-off mistakes. Systematic abuse. That means this was a pattern, a strategy, a deliberate effort to weaponize the federal government against Trump's perceived opponents. Who were these targets? The ruling doesn't name everyone, but based on the pattern we've seen, it likely includes journalists who've been critical of Trump political opponents, whistleblowers, career civil servants who refuse to go along with illegal orders. All of these people, according to the court, had their constitutional rights violated by the Trump administration. And the interference with federal agencies, that's huge, because certain agencies, like the FBI, the Justice Department, independent regulatory agencies, they're supposed to operate with a degree of independence from political pressure. That's how you maintain the rule of law. That's how you prevent presidents from using law enforcement as their personal enforcers. But according to this court ruling, the Trump administration didn't respect that independence. They interfered. They pressured. They tried to bend these agencies to their political will. And in doing so, they violated constitutional principles that have been in place for decades. Now let's talk about what happens next. Because these rulings aren't the end of the story. They're the beginning. The Trump administration is appealing all of these decisions. They're trying to get higher courts to overturn them. But here's the problem with that strategy. Even if they win on appeal, the findings of fact from these lower court rulings don't just disappear. They're part of the official record now. They can be cited in other cases. They can be used in congressional investigations. They can form the basis for criminal referrals. So even if Trump's team manages to overturn these specific rulings on appeal, the damage is already done. The documentation of wrongdoing is out there, and it's being used against them. And several judges have warned, and this is critical, that if the administration keeps defying court orders, criminal contempt charges are possible. That's not a hypothetical. That's judges saying on the record that they're prepared to pursue criminal charges if this behavior continues. And criminal contempt is serious. We're talking about potential jail time, potential fines that can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, potential disbarment for lawyers involved. This isn't just a slap on the wrist. This is the judicial system saying we're done asking nicely, follow our orders, or face criminal prosecution. So who exactly is at risk here? Well, the rulings target the Trump administration broadly, but certain officials are more exposed than others. Any official who was directly involved in ordering the National Guard deployment in Portland, they could face contempt charges. Any official who was involved in the decision to withhold SNAP benefits, they could face charges of abuse of power. Any official who targeted political opponents or interfered with independent agencies, they could face civil rights violations charges. And all of this potentially traces back to Trump himself, because he sets the policy. He makes the ultimate decisions. So even if he didn't personally sign every order, even if he maintained some degree of plausible deniability, the pattern of behavior documented in these court rulings suggests that this was coming from the top. And here's where things get really interesting. These court rulings tie directly to ongoing congressional investigations. Remember all those calls for resignation and impeachment we talked about? Well, now Congress has official court findings to back up their allegations. They can point to federal judges, independent career professionals who've documented systematic abuses of power by the Trump administration that gives congressional investigations more credibility, more teeth. And it makes it harder for Republicans to dismiss everything as partisan politics, because these aren't Democratic congresspeople making accusations. These are federal judges making findings of fact based on evidence. The rulings also impact millions of Americans directly. The SNAP case alone affects 42 million people. The Portland case affects everyone who cares about civil liberties and the proper use of military force on U.S. soil. The political targeting case affects anyone who might be on the wrong side of Trump's enemies list. So this isn't abstract legal theory. This has real-world consequences for real people, and that's going to fuel further public anger, further protests, further demands for accountability. Let's also talk about the political implications. We're heading into the 2026 midterms, and these court rulings are going to be campaign fodder for Democrats. They're going to run ads talking about how federal judges found that Trump's team violated the Constitution, how they withheld food from hungry Americans for political purposes, how they defied court orders. That's powerful messaging, and it's going to be hard for Republicans to counter, because these aren't accusations. These are court findings. They're documented. They're part of the official record. So Republican candidates are going to have to either defend the indefensible or distance themselves from Trump, and neither option is great for them politically. And looking ahead to 2028, if Trump is still in office and tries to run again, which he can't under the 22nd Amendment, but let's say he tries some workaround, these court rulings will haunt him. They'll be used in attack ads. They'll be cited by opponents. They'll be part of his legacy. And if he's not the candidate, if Republicans nominate someone else, that person is going to have to answer for Trump's conduct. They're going to have to explain why they stood by him, why they didn't do more to stop the abuses documented in these court rulings. And that's a tough position to be in. So here's where we are. Multiple federal judges have issued devastating rulings against the Trump administration. They've found willful defiance of court orders, systematic abuse of power, intentional harm to millions of Americans for political purposes, violations of constitutional rights, and they've warned that criminal contempt charges are possible if this behavior continues. The administration is appealing, but the damage is done. The findings are part of the record, and they're going to be used against Trump and his team in congressional investigations, in future legal cases, and in political campaigns. This is a legal reckoning, and it's just getting started. Okay, let's break this whole situation down into clear points, because there's a lot of complex legal stuff here, and it's important to understand exactly what these court rulings mean and why they matter. Point one, the scope of the rulings. We're not talking about one judge in one case finding one problem. We're talking about multiple federal judges in different jurisdictions, all finding serious constitutional violations by the Trump administration. The Portland case found willful defiance of a court order regarding National Guard deployment. The Rhode Island case found intentional withholding of food assistance for political purposes. The Washington case found systematic abuse of power through targeting of political opponents and interference with independent agencies. These aren't isolated incidents. These are part of a pattern. And when multiple judges independently reach similar conclusions about abuse of power, that's significant. It suggests there's real evidence backing up these findings. Point two, what willful defiance means. The Portland ruling specifically raised questions about willful defiance of court orders. This is huge, because willful defiance means the administration knew about the court order, they understood what it said, and they violated it anyway. That's not a mistake. That's not an oversight. That's deliberate contempt of court. And contempt of court can be prosecuted criminally. We're talking about potential jail time for officials involved, potential fines, potential disbarment for lawyers who advise this course of action. This isn't just losing a legal case. This is potentially facing criminal prosecution for defying the judicial system. Point three, the SNAP benefit scandal. Judge McConnell found that the administration withheld full SNAP benefits for political purposes, intentionally jeopardizing aid to 42 million Americans. Let's be clear about what this means. The administration, according to a federal judge, used hunger as a political weapon. They decided that withholding food assistance from vulnerable Americans would give them leverage in some political fight, and they did it, knowing that real people would suffer, knowing that families would go hungry. This isn't just bad policy. This is potentially criminal abuse of power, because if you're using your government position to harm citizens for political gain, that's corruption, and this court ruling documents it. Point four, systematic abuse of power. The Washington case found systematic abuse, not isolated incidents. That word systematic is critical. It means the judge found evidence of a pattern, a strategy, a deliberate effort to weaponize federal agencies against political opponents. This echoes what happened during Watergate. Nixon used federal agencies to target his enemies, and that was one of the reasons he faced impeachment. Now we've got a federal judge documenting similar conduct by the Trump administration, targeting perceived political opponents, interfering with independent agencies, violating constitutional rights, all as part of a systematic effort. This is the kind of finding that can form the basis for criminal referrals, for congressional investigations, for impeachment articles. Point 5, the threat of criminal contempt. Multiple judges have warned that criminal contempt charges are possible if the administration continues defying court orders. This isn't idle talk. This is judges putting the administration on notice. Follow our orders or face criminal prosecution. And they mean it, because the judicial system only works if people respect court orders. If the president and his team can just ignore judges whenever they disagree, then the rule of law breaks down. So judges are drawing a line, and they're prepared to enforce it with criminal charges if necessary. So what are the realistic consequences here? Let's think through the possibilities. First, contempt charges. If the administration continues defying court orders, especially the Portland order about National Guard deployment, judges can initiate contempt proceedings. Those proceedings can result in criminal charges against specific officials. We're talking about the people who actually ordered the violations, who signed off on them, who implemented them. Those individuals could face jail time, could face massive fines, could have their careers ended. So the threat is real, and it's immediate. Second, civil rights lawsuits. The findings in these cases, especially the Washington case about targeting political opponents, they open the door to civil lawsuits by people who were harmed. If you were targeted by the administration because of your political views, you now have a federal court ruling backing up your claim that your rights were violated. You can sue for damages, you can sue for injunctive relief, and you've got a much stronger case because a judge has already found that the administration engaged in systematic abuse. So we could see a wave of lawsuits coming from journalists, whistleblowers, civil servants, and others who feel they were targeted. Third, congressional investigations. These court rulings give Congress powerful ammunition. They can point to independent federal judges who've documented abuses of power. They can use these findings as the basis for deeper investigations, for subpoenas, for hearings, and potentially for new articles of impeachment. Remember, one of the articles in the existing impeachment resolution talks about abuse of power. Well, now we've got federal judges documenting that abuse that makes the impeachment case stronger, more credible, harder to dismiss as partisan politics. Fourth, political consequences. These rulings are going to haunt Trump and Republicans in upcoming elections. Democrats will run ads about how federal judges found constitutional violations, about how the administration withheld food from hungry Americans for political purposes, about how they defied court orders. That's damaging messaging. And it's all documented in official court rulings. So it's hard to dispute. Republican candidates are going to have to answer for this. They're going to have to explain why they stood by Trump, why they didn't demand accountability. And that's going to be uncomfortable for them, especially in swing districts and purple states. Fifth, Trump's historical legacy. Even if Trump avoids criminal charges, even if he finishes his term in office, these court rulings become part of his permanent record, part of his legacy. Future historians will cite these cases as evidence of constitutional abuses during his presidency. Future legal scholars will study them as examples of executive overreach. Trump has always cared deeply about his legacy, about how he'll be remembered, and these rulings ensure that at least part of his legacy will be one of systematic abuse of power documented by federal courts. Now let's talk about what the administration can do in response. Their main strategy right now is appeals. They're trying to get higher courts to overturn these rulings, and they might succeed on some of them. Appellate courts sometimes disagree with district courts. Sometimes they find that the lower court made legal errors. But even if they win on appeal, the findings of fact don't just disappear. The documentation of wrongdoing is still out there, still part of the record, still available to be cited in other proceedings. So appeals might limit the immediate legal consequences, but they don't erase the underlying problems. The administration could also try to argue that they've changed their behavior, that they're now complying with court orders, that they've put new policies in place to prevent future abuses. But that's a tough sell when judges have found willful defiance and systematic abuse, because those findings suggest that the problems weren't just accidents or miscommunications, they were deliberate. So judges are going to be skeptical of promises to do better. They're going to want to see concrete evidence of change, and they're going to be watching closely to make sure the administration actually follows through. The administration could also try political pressure. They could attack the judges publicly, call them partisan, claim the rulings are politically motivated. And Trump has done this before, how he's attacked judges who've ruled against him. But that strategy has risks. because it further erodes respect for the judicial system. It makes Trump look like he doesn't respect the rule of law, and it gives his opponents more ammunition. So while Trump might get some short-term political benefit from attacking judges, in the long run, it probably hurts him more than it helps. So what happens next? Well, in the short term, we're going to see appeals. The administration is going to fight these rulings in higher courts. Some cases might go all the way to the Supreme Court, and we'll see whether the appellate courts uphold these findings or overturn them. We're also going to see whether the administration actually complies with the court orders, especially the orders to restore SNAP funding and to refrain from deploying the National Guard in certain ways. If they don't comply, we could see contempt proceedings initiated, and that would be a whole new level of legal crisis. In the medium term, we were going to see these rulings used in congressional investigations and potentially in new impeachment efforts. Democrats are going to cite these cases as evidence that Trump needs to be removed from office. And some Republicans, especially those facing tough re-election fights, might start to distance themselves from Trump. We're also going to see civil lawsuits from people who were harmed by the administration's actions. Those lawsuits could drag on for years, but they'll keep these issues in the news, keep the pressure on Trump and his team. In the long term, these rulings become part of the historical record. They shape how Trump's presidency is remembered. They influence debates about presidential power and constitutional limits. They serve as warnings to future administrations about what happens when you defy federal courts and abuse executive authority. So even though we're focused on the immediate consequences right now, the real impact of these rulings might not be fully understood for years or even decades. Here's the bottom line. Federal judges have issued devastating rulings against the Trump administration. They found willful defiance of court orders, systematic abuse of power, intentional harm to millions of Americans, violations of constitutional rights. The administration is appealing, but the damage is done. These findings are part of the official record now, and they're going to be used against Trump in congressional investigations, in civil lawsuits, in criminal proceedings, and in political campaigns. This is a legal nuke that's just started detonating, and the fallout is going to be massive. Stay tuned, because this story is far from oversubscribed. Hit that bell and keep watching, because the legal reckoning for the Trump administration is just beginning, and you're not going to want to miss what happens next.